It's 3 o'clock. You're listening to KYRS, Medical Lake, Spokane, 88.1 and 92.3 FM. Coming to you now is Long Waves with Gary Krug. It is New Year's Eve. Yay. I don't know if, like me, you're as happy to get rid of this year as I am, but it's been a crazy year. It's been a crazy year in media. It's been a crazy year in news. Just kind of a year of great unraveling, as I like to call it. Anyway, I would like to thank you for joining us, and I would like to point out that the opinions expressed on this show are solely my own and do not necessarily reflect the views of KYRS, its staff, management, or underwriters. So today I wanted to reflect a bit more on what do we know and how do we know it. There's a big world out there, and we're supposed to have some understandings of it. But where do these understandings come from? Good question, you might say. Thank you. We have people who, politicians, corporations, individuals who are out here shaping our domestic world, and they're shaping the global world. They're building things, they're blowing things up, they're initiating wars, they're committing murders, they're overthrowing governments, and everywhere we look, enemies abound. You cannot swing a cat and not hit some important threat to America's vital interests. It's ISIS, or it's Al-Qaeda, or it's Putin. We're going to talk about Putin today. But what do we actually know of this, and where does it come from, and why? What's a little of the history of why we're supposed to know these things at all? Where does our knowledge come from? Well, there's all kinds of different knowledge about the world. The French sociologist Pierre Bourdieu talked about the habitus, by which he meant just the taken-for-granted rules of the game. How you conduct yourself every day in the world. And you don't even have to think about it. Nobody really had to teach it to you formally. You pick it up from being in the world. And if you've traveled about, you note that the habitus changes between place and place, between group and group. It changes through classes. It changes through cultures. So there's this bit. But that really doesn't explain to us how we understand the world. To get to that, we have to think about the stories that we hear about the world and where those come from and how they are structured. Well, who's telling us the stories? A big part of it is journalists. Journalists, we've been told through our lives, are a kind of special group, a special class of people, a professional group of people who gather information and report on it and tell us what's going on in the world in an objective and unbiased way. Well, Christmas is over, so let's not believe in Santa Claus, because we're all, I think, smarter than that now. We know that the stories the journalists tell us are to a large extent structured by the people who pay the journalists and the people who own the media and the people who are the advertisers who pay and keep the media running. This is, talking about big mainstream corporate American media, everybody's favorite. And, they're other players out there as well, not just journalists who are trying to structure our views of the world. Most governments understand all too well what the great American journalist and writer on such things, a gentleman named Walter Lippmann, meant when he said that public opinion had to be carefully crafted and controlled. In a sense, public opinion is too important to be left to the public. And this sounds pretty shocking, and certainly some people were very shocked by Lippmann's book in 1922 called Public Opinion. In that book, though, he talked about the world outside and the pictures in our head. We only know most of what we know about the world through what we've received vicariously from one form of media or from conversation or something. But it is a real world. And that real world is a place where we must act, and those actions have real consequences. But yet we're driven by the images and the words and the stories in our minds. This is what is most of our world. Now, this raises a lot of interesting problems. If you think about it for a minute, would your behavior necessarily change if the media told you that your country was at war with country Smeg? And you don't even know country Smeg, but we're at war with them and they're diabolical, evil people. Well, if you did know people from Smeg, you'd have to say, well, they're the enemy, and I'll have to treat them as such. You know, and there have been some instances through history where people say living on islands only learned after some period that other people living on those islands were their enemies because the news hadn't come yet from their respective governments. Or think about the last great battle of the War of 1812. In fact, the largest battle of the war, the Battle of New Orleans, which was fought in 1815, if I remember correctly. And the war was actually, that battle was actually fought after the peace treaty had been concluded and was on its way via sailing ships from England to the United States. So seeing a piece of paper with a tick on it changes reality. You're not at war, you are at war. These are friends, these are enemies. And this is a large chunk of how we think the world should work. But let me just go a bit deeper into Lippmann here as we move along. Lippmann made the argument that democratic citizens in countries such as ours, can't really form a public opinion. So he goes on to say that at the level of the nation, public opinion is either manufactured or it's a phantom. And he wrote a book called The Phantom Public. Because people can't come together and deliberate on the issues, on the news. They don't have the experience, they don't have the access, they don't have the frameworks, they don't have the time, and they don't even have a common language to use in discussing the world. So a knowledgeable citizenry engaged in an act of deliberation, does that sound like anyone you know? Not so much. So this is a crucial problem for democracies. Can the public be true to a higher public good? Can the public step out of their own parochial interests and act in the good of others, act in the good of all, even if it reduces some of their privilege and some of their benefit? Well, one would like to think we could, but it's really not borne out in real life for a lot of reasons. We live in kind of parochial backwaters, so to speak, provincial and unschooled in the world. We don't know the world, and a lot of people really have no interest in learning about it in depth. A remarkably small number of Americans actually have passports. A remarkably small number of Americans ever leave the country. Now, maybe this is because they feel so comfortable and proud to be here, and everything's right here, and they're all comfortable in their nice comfy chairs with their nice comfy TVs and their nice comfy SUVs. I mean, maybe that's it. Or maybe they just would be embarrassed and pushed out of their comfort zones too much. Might have to learn something, might have to talk to people. And the sad truth is that when Americans do go overseas, they tend to float around on this cushion of dollars in these tight little well-managed tour groups. And you don't see a lot of people just walking the streets, talking, getting to know folks, getting out from under that cushion of dollars. We just don't see it. So for a variety of reasons, Americans generally are not terribly interested in the world. They don't know anything about it. They couldn't find Afghanistan on a map, most of them, if you put it in front of them. So geography, nah, too hard. Who cares? Governments, not so much. History, oh, no. We can't even get our own history straight. It's so distorted. Political science, oh, gosh. Sociology, how societies function. Well, probably not. How about this one? How language works. That would be an interesting thing to study. How do languages work around the world? And again, Americans are among the most monolingual people on the planet. Most folks around the world speak a variety of languages. Monolingual people are actually something of a rarity, but, we have here, instead of embracing a plurality of languages, a kind of hunkering down, an English-only mentality, which goes to the point that I'm going to be addressing today. We are faced, though, with changes in our world. Things pop up. Things fall apart. We get these news events that flash at us from the screens, and these are complexities that require, or should require, an understanding, but it's an understanding that most people simply don't have and aren't really interested in. So they're very happy when somebody just tells them what they're supposed to think about it. And Fox News excels at this. Dumb, meaningless phrases that can be parroted ad nauseum without meaning, without understanding, just empty, hollow words. Awesome. America's awesome. Do they hate us because of our awesomeness? Well, it's a good question. But we are forced from time to time to face our own ignorance because we're required by the myth of being citizens or being Americans. And we kind of have to butt up into, well, there's something here that maybe I should know, maybe I should understand, and golly, I just don't know if it's a place a lot of folks want to go. So we have no language or vocabulary or mental framework for understanding the world. Well, the bad thing about this is it makes people vulnerable to propaganda and to persuasion. It makes people vulnerable to propaganda and persuasion. Journalists were supposed to fill out this void. That was one of the great myths that journalists themselves created in the late 19th and early 20th century when they first started creating journalism schools at colleges. The idea was, they were this class, and they did have these special duties, and they would look out for the public interest, but it just never played out well, now did it? I mean, even from the beginning, we could think about the large news organizations run by Pulitzer or Hearst, or the contemporary news organizations run by Murdoch or GM and Viacom and Disney. What interest would they have in helping us understand the world? Rather, they have great interests in giving us particular understandings of the world, most of which is small, stupid fragments of simplistic drivel. Small, stupid fragments of simplistic drivel. And worse, we know that the advertisers and even our own government manipulate us and other countries into believing what they would have us believe. John Pilger, the Australian journalist, and a very fine journalist, wrote a piece recently called War by Media and the Triumph of Propaganda. I'll be borrowing from this throughout the show, but I'll start with a couple of quotes from him. Quote, "The information age is actually a media age. We have war by media, censorship by media, demonology by media, retribution by media, diversion by media, a surreal assembly line of obedient cliches and false assumptions. This power to create a new reality has been building for a long time. 45 years ago, a book entitled The Greening of America caused a sensation. On the cover were these words, 'There's a revolution coming. It will not be like revolutions of the past. It will originate with the individual.'" Well, we know where all that meism went, don't we? All that materialism and all that sense of, oh, it's all about me and mine and getting mine. But that does strike home. The information age is actually a media age. Demonology by media. Further on in the essay, he discusses an interview he had with Charles Lewis, a distinguished American journalist. And this was right after the invasion of Iraq. Pilger said, "What if the freest media in the world had seriously challenged George Bush and Donald Rumsfeld and investigated their claims instead of channeling what turned out to be crude propaganda?" Lewis replied that if journalists had done their job, quote, "there is a very, very good chance we would not have gone to war in Iraq." Dan Rather told Pilger exactly the same thing. David Rose of The Observer told Pilger exactly the same. Senior journalists and producers in BBC told Pilger exactly the same. If journalists had done their jobs instead of amplifying propaganda, hundreds of thousands of people, men and women and children, might well be alive, and the country of Iraq would not be lying in ruins with a dysfunctional government. And a lot of people who aren't with us might be with us. So what I want to get into a bit today is some of the history of how these mechanisms in government, this propaganda machine, what Ronald Reagan's people referred to as perception management, came into being. And it was during Reagan's period that this modern incarnation of information management, perception management, emerged. Think about it this way. Sometimes it is in the interests of people in power, the interests of corporations, the interests of the military, the interests of the military-industrial complex, the government, to convince people of the justice of war. Think about Vietnam, stopping the dominoes of communism. Think about Grenada. I'm not even sure why we were in Grenada, something about socialism. Panama, the evil Noriega in Panama. Well, Noriega was on the CIA payroll. Come on, people. Afghanistan, Iraq. There's a long list that I won't go into. But how do you get people to actually buy the justice of a war? You repeat the lie over and over and over and over. Sometimes you don't even need evidence. You can just lie. We saw the head of NATO. We saw reporters from The Guardian talk about this Russian troops crossing the border into Ukraine. There were no Russian troops crossing the border into Ukraine. If there were, there would have been photographs. The journalists who said they were standing right there and witnessing it couldn't get their cell phones out of their pockets, apparently, to deal with it. We see propaganda that is, no one even pretends to document. They don't even pretend they need evidence. They can just say it. The way Dick Cheney could just say things about Iraq, could just make up whole lies. The way they could find the most transparent prevaricators from Iraq stack them up there, in a stuffed suit. I'm talking about people like Chalabi now, and have them spout nonsense for money. And the media largely accepted this unquestionably, with the exception, I would add, of the Knight Ridder news chain in the U.S. and some independent journalists. But basically it was accepted hook, line, and sinker. Nobody looked into it. And you can think about the great media organizations, the liberal media, as the folks on Fox like to call it, the New York Times, Washington Post, BBC, Guardian. They were actually the ones selling the war. They were the ones selling the evidence. And the evidence they sold was believed precisely because they are not Fox News. Anything you see on Fox News you take with a grain of salt, right? But you see things in the New York Times, you go, whoa, New York Times, this is important, it must be real. Washington Post, the BBC, the Guardian, they lied. They didn't investigate. Sometimes they knew they were lying. The case of Judith Miller, who was being spoon-fed information out of Dick Cheney's office. And then Dick Cheney would stand up and hold the New York Times in his hand and said, I'm not saying this, the New York Times is saying this. And so it goes. Currently, we have a great suppression of truth going on. And most of it is about Russia. Most of it's about Russia, and particularly about the Ukraine. We're going to have some fun with that today. I want to pick out just a few bits from John Pilger's essay, where he talks about the suppression of truth. I'll quote him. The suppression of the truth about Ukraine is one of the most complete news blackouts I can remember. The biggest Western military buildup in the Caucasus and Eastern Europe since World War II is blacked out. Y'all didn't know about the big buildup of American equipment and troops and forward basing and training of all of these troops in Latvia and Estonia and Poland? Did y'all miss that? It's happening. It's all over the international press. It's being published in a lot of places, everywhere except apparently in the UK and the US. Washington's secret aid to Kiev and its neo-Nazi brigades, responsible for war crimes against the population of eastern Ukraine, is blacked out. Did y'all miss that? The secret aid to Kiev, the coup that the U.S. pulled there that brought down a admittedly corrupt but democratically elected government and replaced it with a admittedly corrupt and not terribly democratic government. It happened. So it's all blacked out. If there's any evidence that contradicts the propaganda that Russia had shot down the Malaysian airliner, Flight 310, it's blocked out. And all the talking heads have to do is stand there and go, well, Russia shot down the airplane. Where is the evidence? NATO friendly countries and Ukraine have had the black boxes, they've had the physical airplane, they've had all the data from all the flight controls, air traffic control around the region. They've issued a preliminary report that said nothing. Nothing, nothing, nothing. Pilger continues. And again, supposedly liberal media are the censors. Citing no facts, no evidence, one journalist identified a pro-Russian leader in Ukraine as the man who shot down the airliner. No evidence, no facts, just say it. This man, he wrote, was known as the Demon. He was a scary man who frightened the journalist. That's his evidence. That's his evidence. I mean, this is just crazy. So we've got NATO General Breedlove, who on several occasions has claimed that Russia has invaded Ukraine. Pilger writes, 40,000 Ruskies massing on the border, according to Breedlove. That was good enough for the New York Times, the Washington Post, and the Observer, the latter having previously distinguished itself with lies and fabrications that backed Blair's invasion of Iraq, as its former reporter David Rose revealed. So we have to wonder, as did Robert Perry, another American journalist. If you wonder, Perry wrote, how the world could stumble into World War III much as it did into World War I 1 century ago, all you need to do is look at the madness that has enveloped virtually the entire U.S. political media structure over Ukraine, where a false narrative of white hats versus black hats took hold early and is proved impervious to facts or reason. Right, Perry's the journalist who broke Iran-Contra, right? He's the guy who uncovered Iran-Contra. And he's one of the people who actually digs into this. But it is true that we're playing a very dangerous game in Ukraine. The U.S. forward-basing troops and equipment, and meanwhile feeding America and anybody who will listen to their nonsense complete lies about what's going on. Complete lies about it. This raises even more interesting questions, does it not? We're getting close to this issue of perception management, I promise you. So what's going on with the journalists? Well, journalists who dissent are fired or they just cease to exist. I mean, think about one of the great journalistic ploys of the 21st century, one of the great journalistic exploits, WikiLeaks. WikiLeaks. Julian Assange and WikiLeaks got that leaked information from the American soldier, screened it, vetted it, released it. And last I heard, Julian Assange is still living in the Ecuadorian embassy in London and is persona non grata. And nobody talks about WikiLeaks. Nobody gives them awards. And Pilger suggests that the reason they are so hated, WikiLeaks and Assange, is, quote, they tore down the facade of a corrupt political elite held aloft by journalists. So in other words, he illuminated and shamed the gatekeepers, journalism. Illuminated and shamed them. You know, sometimes we believe in the evil of an enemy. I mean, think of the enemies we've had. Hitler. Hitler was a bad guy, no question. Nobody's holding him up as a nice guy. But think about the people we fought, Ho Chi Minh, Noriega, and now Putin. Right? They have to sell us the idea that these are inherently evil people. Ho Chi Minh was painted as this horrible communist. Ho Chi Minh was a nationalist. First, last, and above all, he was a nationalist. Much the same with Putin. It's not what people do, it's what is said about them. Right? If you think about Putin, it's not what he does, it's what's said about him. And notice the people we don't say horrible things about. We don't say horrible things about the Saudis, even though they chop off heads on TV, just like ISIS, even though they are a repressive regime, even though they routinely violate human rights. We don't demonize the Saudi royal family. We don't demonize Israel. And sometimes it'll happen that one of our friends will do something that makes the United States unhappy. In other words, refuse to be a servile vassal of the U.S., and then they become evil. So you think about Turkey, for example. Turkey was okay for a while, but now they're holding hands with Putin. And they're blocking America's plans to destroy Russia by signing the deal with Putin to allow the South Stream gas pipeline to run through Turkey rather than the Ukraine. There are good reasons for Russia and Turkey wanting to do this, but none of them suggest that either Erdogan or Putin have been somehow magically transformed into evil villains, but you wouldn't know that from the U.S. press. And we have this long series of evil bullies, do we not? These evil villains, we just every time we turn around. Robert Perry made the comment that Americans are trapped in, quote, an Orwellian dystopia of endless warfare with an ever-shifting collection of evil enemies. And it's true. And it's not by accident. And it's not because the world is filled with evil enemies of the United States. It's because of well-executed, well-planned, government-funded propaganda in the U.S. and in other countries. It's like one of our major exports. Robert Perry, writing for Consortium News on the 28th of December of this year, observes that this notion of perception management starts with the Reagan years. And it does seem to trump the democratic ideal of an informed electorate. Right? So we don't want to honestly inform American people about what's going on in the world, but manage their perceptions, ramp up their fears, and ramp up their outrage. So, quoting, thus you have the current hysteria over Russia's supposed aggression in Ukraine, when the crisis was actually provoked by the West, including by U.S. neocons who helped create today's humanitarian crisis in East Ukraine that they now cynically blame on Russian President Putin. If the Russians act to shield ethnic Russians on their border who are being bombarded by a coup regime in Kiev that was installed with U.S. support, the Russians are the villains, blamed for the thousands of civilian deaths, even though the vast majority of the casualties have been inflicted by the Kiev regime from indiscriminate bombing and from dispatching neo-Nazi militias to do the street fighting. In Ukraine, the exigent circumstances don't matter, including the violent overthrow of the constitutionally elected president last February. Excuse me. It's all about white hats for the current Kiev regime and black hats for the ethnic Russians. Okay, well, this goes back to, as I said, Reagan. And after Vietnam, there was the protests really scared the government. Very much did. The protest that anyone would dare, that Americans would dare voice a democratic opinion and oppose their government in a war, was a terrifying idea. So they set about fixing it in the 1980s. All right? They set about creating various kinds of agencies and bringing in people from organizations that had a pretty good knowledge of how these things work. And I'm speaking specifically of the CIA, and specifically of people like William Casey and Walter Raymond, and some other people we could mention. But, we could think about Robert Kagan, who started off. Robert Kagan is a stand-up neocon. He's also married to Victoria Nuland, who's the Assistant Secretary of State for European Affairs, the woman of the famous phone call, right? F, the EU. Anyway, he got his start working in Reagan's Office of Public Diplomacy for Latin America. I love these, oh gosh, the way they can twist things around. So anyway, Kagan's now at the Brookings Institute, and he writes for the New York Times. And anyway, so what they did was they set up a two-pronged approach. One was to weed out American reporters who uncovered facts that undercut the desired image. So the administration attacked, for example, New York Times correspondent Raymond Bonner for disclosing that El Salvador regime's massacre of about 800 men, women, and children in El Mozota in northeast El Salvador in December 1981 accuracy in media and conservative news organizations, quoting now, and conservative news organizations such as the Wall Street Journal's editorial page joined in pummeling Bonner, who was soon ousted from his job. But the real stuff starts when they decide they need a, quote, more comprehensive public diplomacy operation, which starts in '82 when Raymond, a 30-year veteran of CIA clandestine services, was transferred to the National Security Council. What could go wrong with that? So what they did was they set up campaigns modeled on CIA covert operations abroad, quoting now, where a political goal is more important than the truth. Quote, they were trying to manipulate U.S. public opinion using the tools of Walt Raymond's tradecraft, which he had learned from his career in the CIA covert operations shop. All right, take this in a minute. CIA covert operations being operated in the United States to mold opinions. So this was a big part of this was around the the Nicaraguan Contras. Ollie North, who was a National Security Council staffer, spent a large amount of time apparently on the Nicaraguan public diplomacy operation. We remember him for arranging secret arms deals, but in violation of the Boland Amendment. But he was also involved in setting up this domestic propaganda. Even after, quoting again, even after the Iran-Contra scandal unraveled in 1986 and 87, and Casey died of brain cancer in 87, the Republicans fought to keep secret the remarkable story of the public diplomacy apparatus. As part of the deal to get 3 moderate Republicans to join Democrats in signing the Iran-Contra Majority Report, Democratic leaders agreed to drop the draft chapter detailing the CIA's domestic propaganda role. So they decided they would just drop that bit about, oh yeah, the CIA's running domestic propaganda. George H.W. Bush kicked in a similar kind of organization, which I won't go into in too much depth, except to say it was Bush who, after his Iraq invasion, said, quote, by God, we've kicked the Vietnam syndrome once and for all. Once and for all. And again, think of the pictures we didn't see until well after the war. Think of the Highway of Death. Think of the pictures that they try to suppress from the Second Iraq War. Think of the pictures we still haven't seen. Anyway, so now this organization created back in the 80s has sort of expanded. And one of its major organizations I've talked about on this show before is a group called the National Endowment for Democracy. You can't make up these names. This is just amazing. The National Endowment for Democracy was formed in 1983 at the suggestion of CIA Director William Casey. It was supervised by Walter Raymond's National Security Council and is still run by the same neocon, Carl Gershom, but now with a budget from the U.S. of over $100 million a year. So Gershom and NED, National Endowment for Democracy, were very important in instigating what went on in Ukraine. Right? You might remember Yulin was bragging about the $5 billion the U.S. spent in Ukraine building democracy before the coup, buying people off, buying off organizations, financing activists, journalists, other operatives to support the coup against elected President Yanukovych. Yeah, it happened. So it didn't just come out of nowhere. It specifically came out of the CIA. So the CIA has been running this organization part of which operates overseas, but then we have this branch that operates here, which of course is not the CIA because that would be illegal. It just has other terms. It just has other names. And we see the evidence of it everywhere. And Ukraine is such a stellar example of just shameless propaganda and rumor mongering. I mean, just absolutely shameless. So, for example, there was a piece on the Russian press discussing some of the concerns with NPR, with National Public Radio. And I have to admit, in some of the NPR news, so-called, that I've heard lately, they have gotten much better at singing the company's song, and that may have something to do with the Koch brothers' influence in the organization. Maybe not. Maybe they're just taking a hard turn to the right. But anyway, they're singing basically the same kind of propaganda nonsense. So, for example, Corey Flintoff. Corey Flintoff had a news report. Yes, she did. This is back in December, where it was called For Russia's President, A Year of Costly Triumphs. And it repeatedly said that the cause of the economic sanctions against Russia is Russia's seizure of Crimea. So, I mean, this is the company song right here. The transfer of Crimea back to Russia was some sort of theft, right? After Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev had donated it to Ukraine in 1954 against the wishes of Crimea's residents, which Flintoff conveniently failed to even mention. This instead had been Russia's aggression. And goes out to point that Flintoff leaves out some rather significant information. The March 16th, 2014 referendum of voters in Crimea. 96% voted to secede from Ukraine. Or various Gallup polls that show overwhelming alliance with Russians. Most of them are Russian-speaking. Most of them are ethnically Russian. And then the idea that somehow Russia was just going to allow Crimea and its naval base at Sevastopol, its Black Sea Fleet, was just going to let that go. I mean, they've only had a fleet there since 1783. And just the notion that they were somehow just going to let that go is nonsensical. It is nonsensical. Look at it from the Russian side. All of the aggression is coming from the West. So let's see, you're extending NATO when you promised expressly that NATO would not expand. Oh, well, we weren't serious. We were going to do it anyway. So it's hard not to see that as a threat. Then the U.S., which the U.S. brought about by bringing various countries into NATO, and then now the U.S. is doing all these military operations and training troops and bringing equipment and forward basing it and trying to erect a wall of anti-ballistic missiles, anti-missile missiles, basically, around Russia. So it's hard not to see that as aggression. Then the U.S. rather ham-handedly and openly, through a coup, takes down a democratically elected leader, appoints their hand-picked folks, funds extreme right and neo-Nazis to use both for force and in the government. It is hard not to see this as aggression from Russia's point of view. I don't know how else one could spin this, you know? So, it's funny. We really don't in America. Nobody really in America knows much about the world. You know, ordinary folks really don't know that much about the world. I'm sure that Newland and her husband have a great deal of very specialized knowledge, but they're not actually interested in promoting democracy. And this is the tragic story. The United States is not interested in promoting democracy, not at home or abroad. Iraq? No. Afghanistan? No. Where? Where has the U.S. succeeded in where we even tried to promote democracy? Our favorite trick is to go in and knock over some little country and install military dictators who will do what we want them to do and make the place safe for corporations. Smedley Butler, U.S. General Smedley Butler, back in the 30s, famously remarked about his service in the Philippines and in South America that he was a bag man for American corporations and an enforcer, a muscle guy. Said he could teach Al Capone tricks. Said Capone could only manage 3 districts. I operated on 3 continents. And he was right, he did. But let's just think a minute. What do Americans actually know about the world? What do Americans actually know about Russia? What do they actually know about... Well, let's take Russia. What do Americans actually know? What's the name of the Russian Prime Minister? Tough one. Russian Foreign Minister? Russian Ambassador to the U.S.? Where is Ukraine on a map? Yet the Russians have such a keen understanding of America, not because we're so important, but because they read, they pay attention. It's funny, a lot of people in the world do that. And I had some colleagues once upon a time, back when there was an Iron Curtain, and we were discussing things, and they looked at me and said, Americans are just so strange. They think their news tells them the truth. We always knew we were being lied to, and so the simple task was to try and read between the lines. If we accept the premise that we're being lied to, then we can just look between the lines here and see a little more of what's going on. But anyway, the Russians are having some good time at our expense. They're not above some good jokes and some humor. So apparently, one of their bits is they have there's this country in North America called Pindosia, or Pindostan, or officially the United States of Pindostan. And one part of it, in Alaska, used to be part of Russia. So Stan, of course, is an underdeveloped state, like in Pakistan, Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, and the country is composed of Pindoses, 316 million Pindoses in Pindostan. Well, Pindos, apparently, in Russian is highly offensive word, which defines a helpless creature that's the product of a very bad educational system, who can only survive with the help of various gadgets. Nobody knows where the word comes from, but some people suggest that the word was invented by Russian peacekeepers in Serbia, who were trying to describe NATO soldiers who looked to them to be strange, clumsy figures with 90 pounds of bulletproof vest, weapons, flashlights, radios, and things like this. I'm getting all this, by the way, from the New York Observer. The Russians have taken to calling President Obama Maximka, after a character in a popular Soviet movie from 1952 about a black boy who's saved from Anglo slavers by Russian sailors. But sometimes they get rather specific when they want to talk about their Pindoses. Quoting now, One of them, the constant laughingstock in the media, used to be the U.S. ambassador to Moscow, Michael McFaul. He was a huge fan of Twitter, and if you judge by the number of his tweets, spent more time on his gadget than actually doing his job. After more than 2 years of service there, upon his departure, he received only 2 words in Russian via Twitter from the Russian Ministry for Foreign Affairs. Goodbye, Mikhail. Today, the place has been taken by the spokesperson for the U.S. Department of State, Jan Psaki. She has an anti-fan club of haters who consider her not to be very bright. They even invented their own anti-IQ unit called One Psaki. One who has 3 Psakis has a brain of a clam. And they even have a verbal form, psaking, which in Russian political newspeak means to know nothing about a subject while saying something banal and politically correct. They also have a special place in their heart for Senator John McCain. And I keep remembering Gore Vidal's description of McCain, talking about those deep black little orphan Annie eyes of his. There's something kind of creepy about them. Anyway, and he is tied up quite deeply in the National Endowment for Democracy, and was in Ukraine, hanging out with the Nazis. Some great pictures of him with his arms around Nazis, not even neo-Nazis. These are old school Nazis. Right? Sitting there grinning because he was over there helping to bring democracy. Not. Anyway, so apparently McCain is famous in Putin, and is famous in Russia, for his periodic tweets to Dear Vlad. So in 2011, apparently, McCain tweeted Putin, Dear Vlad, the Arab Spring is coming to a neighborhood near you. Well, given that the U.S. was already setting up things for Ukraine, that actually sounds a bit like a threat. And anyway, Putin finally had enough and made the statement, quote, Mr. McCain was captured in Vietnam, and they kept him not just in prison, but in a pit for several years. Anyone in his place would have had his roof moved over. And apparently the last 3 words in Russian slang mean you become insane. You have your roof moved over. So just saying, McCain is crazy. He's a lunatic. So enormous investments in domestic propaganda are necessary, in part to ensure that, as Robert Perry said, we have either the public's eager support or at least its confused acquiescence of imperial adventures. I love that turn of phrase. The public's eager support or at least its confused acquiescence of imperial adventures. The media aren't even trying to pretend they're not doing this, to pretend they're not just repeating the most obvious propaganda. The most probable, fanciful lies can be spoken with straight faces, with this look of complete honesty. And we want to believe it. We start with our ideas of what the world should be, and we're only too happy when someone from our government or our media proclaim, like that woman on Fox News, the awesomeness of America. And it seems to me that apparently the rest of the world now hates us because of our awesomeness. At least it used to be our freedoms or our standard of living, but now it's awesomeness. Woo! Gotta love this stuff. But the end of these deceptions is the revelation that our democracy is dead. Dead. Lying on the floor. Call the coroner. The rich run our world, and our government is a leisure service of domestic oligarchs, sometimes international oligarchs. And our dreams and our ideas and our fantasies and hopes and our fears, especially our fears, are created for us and served to us on television, on radio. Our world is fears and enemies and lies. You know, Reagan had, I have to quote Reagan here, but not in the sense that he meant it. Government is the problem. Government is the problem. And above all, what has to be buried, what has to be obfuscated, what has to be denied, what has to be diverted into issues of racial division or something like that is class division. Class division, which is much more vicious and much more prominent in the United States than open racism. Class division is everywhere, and it's growing, and it's becoming more and more intense and more noticeable. And the uber-rich are starting to freak out. The 1% are becoming very concerned that eventually the veil will fall from the eyes of the great unwashed, and they will see, and they will be angry, and these guys are going to have to disappear to their luxury bunkered complexes, which are being built for them in places like New York and Dubai and London, you know, complete with their own security and fences and the whole bit, right downtown, you know, so they can still enjoy the standard of living. But, so we have to hide, the media have to hide the truth of class division, above all in this country, and to continue our schooling in what we've learned about the necessity of citizens to be submissive and docile and to surrender totally to the obscenity of power and wealth. And eventually, given the effectiveness of contemporary persuasion technologies upon our already impoverished abilities to cobble together some small sense of the world, we will come to emulate that grotesque image of happy slaves singing and dancing, but not on the plantation, in the military-industrial complex. I'll close with a quote from Gore Vidal. The real issue is class. We have the greatest divide between the very rich and the very poor of any country on earth, surpassing even France. And this division gets wider and wider as financial disasters overwhelm us. We must acknowledge that our character, never much good in these matters, is now reprehensible. The days of greed through which we all lived now have not done us much good, and nor have they taught us any lessons. But you cannot live long with such divisions, which in my view as an outsider overlooking the scene seems to be a nation of total liars. Everybody is lying. Television lies, candidates lies, and everyone says, oh, they always have. I love that excuse. Well, they haven't always done that. Sometimes lying to the people is a great mistake, and it is well known that the rich will pay almost any lie to avoid paying taxes. From the late, great Gore Vidal. Well, that brings me to the end of today's show. I'd like to thank you for joining. You've been listening to Long Waves with Gary Krug on KYRS, Medical Lake in Spokane, 88.1 and 92.3 FM. I'll be back next week. And until then, Happy New Year and stay safe.